Okay, so this is episode 6 of the Church Fathers. I've just clicked record. The Digi voice has told me we're on. So, Tom, we've had a nice week. Been up and it's been down. There's been tragedies in the local community. There's been positives in our families and little wins here and there. You know, life has happened to us this past week. How would you summarize your week in 2 sentences? And you can't use the phrase "Lord have mercy," which we spoke yesterday.
So, yeah, learning to listen would be how I'd describe it. Trying to slow down and listen to God.
Trying to slow down and listen to God. Okay, cool.
Yeah, having slowed down and listened to God as well.
Yeah.
I'm
What
trying to
pro-
avoid more than 2 sentences.
what prompted that mainly?
Lots of things that I can't or wouldn't be able to go into too much detail on. But one thing that someone said recently, I watched something this week, about a Christian man who loves walking up hills, and he said something like, "Men need to walk up a mountain to meet with God." And I kind of get where he's coming from. Walking up the hill near our house lots and praying this last week, and finding that such a good thing to do. Um, that's mine. How about your week? 2 sentences. Can you do 2 sentences?
Um,
Challenge.
oh, breakthrough at work. Yeah. Um, breakthrough at work in understanding. So I feel like, so end of sentence one. The reason being, I feel like I've got a way forwards in terms of understanding the big picture of language teaching, which is my day job. And the other one would be investing in those closest to me in order to build something for generations to come. So it's interesting you talk about slowing down, because ever since I've had kids, particularly this third child, it's totally thrown our family routine out the window. Really, we've had to kind of start from scratch, because having two toddlers and a baby has been it's been ruthless. It's been absolutely ruthless. And the things that we used to do before, good routines that we'd fallen into, were all based upon having two very mobile, toddlers who would run ahead and who could get in the car without help, that kind of thing. Obviously, click the seatbelt for them, but you know what I mean. You're not having to carry an immobile, little baby or a newborn around who doesn't sleep when you want. So it's just interesting to talk about slowing down, because I felt a little bit. I suppose sentence three would be that I felt like I'm in a wind tunnel and I'm trying to get out, and it's just been hitting me in the face all the time.
Yeah, I remember having Isaac. That's quite a big adjustment. I found it harder to go in 2 to 3, and Sophie found it harder going 1 to 2. Um, I was at home though. We were like, it was like lockdown and stuff, and I was so like lunchtime. I was straight on it. Dinner time, straight
Sure.
on it. Changing up, getting to sleep, whatever.
Well, you
But
step out
yeah,
of one workplace, don't you, and you're straight into another work. I mean, it's a great workplace, but it's not. It's you are at work as a dad, and it's good work, but it's tough. Now, one thing interestingly that someone at church yesterday mentioned, and somebody else mentioned to me on social media, was that they feel like they're eavesdropping into our private conversations. So I felt like laying it clear for any listeners that we are very, very happy to share these conversations with people. We are not podcast pros. We feel like these conversations are really worth having. We don't feel like they're being had enough. And we hope that they prompt more conversation. And if people want to drop comments on the YouTube videos, or get in touch in an appropriate manner on social media, please do. We'd love to hear your questions, hear your thoughts.
we
Yeah.
welcome more comments.
So yeah, maybe one day, Lord willing, this thing will grow into a wider community. We are two dads. It's called the Church Fathers. My vision, with God's blessing, would be that we can really connect with other men, but just Christians in general, who in not exclusively, but probably more geographically linked to Britain and Europe, and who are looking to have these sorts of meatier conversations, and who are looking for that that deeper expression of faith. I watched The Mandalorian. I don't know if you've watched it or if you're a Star Wars fan, but I finished the first series of Mandalorian this week, and it is electric. It's an absolutely amazing film. And I think one of the reasons why it's a great film, and this isn't a segue, it will come on to the article that you gave me, because there's a great line at the end of the series where, so the Mandalorian, he never takes off his helmet. That's just part of that's part of, this is the way, that's the Mandalorian way. And he's asked by someone, basically they ask, is being a Mandalorian, are you a race? You're in this multicultural, intergalactic community. Is it a race of the Mandalorians? He's like, no. I was basically adopted in. I'm a foundling. I was brought in. Being a Mandalorian, it's not a race. It's a creed. And I thought, wow, that's such a meaty word. It's such a deep word. If we were ever going to do a word study, really delve into the etymology of a word, creed would be like a valid contender, because it stems into credo, the idea of belief, but this idea of being an all-encompassing belief system that guides your entire life. It's what you orient everything towards. And the interesting thing with The Mandalorian, with Din, I don't want to get his name wrong, but Din, is that he doesn't flex his creed for anything. That defines him. This is the way. That is the way I walk as a Mandalorian. And one of those things, I never take off my helmet. Even when I'm going to bleed to death and all I need is a plaster, I ain't taking this helmet off, because this is the way. And I'm getting all excited because it's an amazing series. But the reason why it's valid is because you sent me a very interesting article where the Guardianistas are kind of tap dancing on the grave of British Christianity, because apparently it's taken them decades to realize what we've known for a long time, that we are not in the majority anymore. Okay.
Overinflated statistics, aren't they? It's saying, as a result of the 2021 census, they're saying about 45% Christian. Obviously, we would know that that's probably not true. That's way far above than what we'd imagine to be true. But also, I love this sentence. You probably noticed this one. Where are we now? Oh, it has 3 different stories of 3 different people and how they lost their. For James, a program manager from Birmingham, it was more of a. It was more of a creeping realization as he got older that certain aspects of Christian dogma were incompatible with critical thinking. There's the slam down in the middle of the article there. The Guardian stating as fact that certain aspects of Christian dogma are incompatible with critical thinking. You've read it here first.
C.S. Lewis would have a field day with this. He absolutely would. So would Van Til.
Death knell has been told, and that's it. It's over now, isn't it? Just a slow line from here.
Well, you can tell this guy and his 7-year-old daughter, who got another zinger at her Church of England school, well, who made God? It's like, whoa, what a slam dunk zinger,
To be fair, to be fair, in some ways, I'm going to give that the benefit of the doubt, in terms of, if someone talks to me about the Big Bang, I might say, well, what started it? What was the cause?
We'll give a 7-year-old the benefit of the doubt, but
yeah, I'm going to give the 7-year-old the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not going to give so much the benefit of the doubt.
James, the program manager from Birmingham. Tom, tell me why this article, though.
They had to go outside the UK, though.
Did they?
Didn't they? Oh no, maybe not. Okay, a guy who was raised in the Church of Latter-day Saints in the US, who's now based in. That was their 3rd story.
Yeah.
So that's slightly scraping the barrel. No offense to him.
No, we don't mean him any offense, but it's interesting that they incorporate Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, and basically they just cheapen the name of Jesus. If you use the name Jesus in your religion, then you must be a Christian. But tell me, Tom, why this article struck a chord with you, and as based on what I was saying about creed and this idea of actually an all defining something that controls you. That was the sense I got reading these 3 people's testimonies. Is this was just no longer compatible with what I wanted. Was basically the humanistic creed. I will, therefore.
There's a
And
bit.
I just, yeah, honestly, when I was watching The Mandalorian, it was far from like a religious experience, but it was just one of these wonderful moments where something spoke truth. This idea of having a creed, that's the word. It's the creed. This belief system, this um, guiding set of principles that are concrete. They're not. You don't get to throw them away. The way he became a Mandalorian is he made an oath. I thought that was really interesting. We think about baptism and the vows that we make. We do live in a society where promises and vows and oaths, they are cheap. They don't mean much. If you make a promise, you had the old saying, I give you my word, your word is your bond. But tell me, if there's any meat in there for you, what this article spoke to you, and how the Mandalorian Star Wars TV series ties into it.
Yeah, well, they're like a really. I mean, it's a short article. There are many portraits of how these three people lost their faith that they had. But there's some interesting clues in there about. And what I'm always asking is when you see someone's lost their faith and what are their reasons, I'm always kind of wondering, well, how reflective is the faith that they describe of Christian faith? How is it? How reflective is it of orthodoxy, however we might define that? And so sometimes you get little clues in there that actually, maybe what they believed might not necessarily have reflected who God is and his actual character and nature,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
nuances to their belief that, for example, the first story is a story of a lady called Diana. Um, there's two things that stick out here. There's one to do with the relationship between a husband and wife and what that should look like as Christian, what she had trouble with seemingly, and the other was to do with suffering and the hope of healing. So she says, losing my faith was a process of gradual disengagement. She says, at some point, I didn't think that I, as a woman, was made to submit to a man. So that's the hint about that. She doesn't say anything more. The final straw was watching my father die of cancer and trying to do so without pain relief, as it was God's will, while waiting to be healed. I finally admitted to myself that I didn't believe in a supernatural being and couldn't pretend anymore. So, I mean, she only hints at this idea of relationship, like women submitting to men. So I think it's almost not fair to kind of talk about that because, well, there's something in there. But there's the bit that struck out to me was, okay, so her dad was dying of cancer. He did so without pain relief, which is interesting because the only people I know who, well, no, some people would choose to do that, but as an actual grouping, no, actually, I don't really know. Are there certain Christian groupings or sects, I think, that sort of like are against pain relief, aren't there? I'm trying to think of who it is.
Well, the Jehovah's Witness will deny a blood transfusion, but
Yeah, that's
I do not know.
no.
I mean, I think it's an important point from memory that she mentioned she was raised in a fundamentalist group up in the north of England.
Yes.
So maybe they're actually using fundamentalist in its correct term. I don't know. We're probably talking like independent church that's got some pretty extraordinary views that you and I would probably sit there going, how have you arrived at that conclusion? Wow,
Yeah.
that's incredible.
Yeah.
In the negative sense, that's incredible. Like, how? Wow, gosh, there must be a God because that's a miracle that you arrived at that conclusion.
Exactly. And yeah, and it kind of there's obviously a good question in there. She's got some. She's this event and her father's approach to pain relief, his father's approach to hope of healing.
Yeah.
She's got some significant questions she had at that time.
Mm,
Whether or not she sought out the answers or not, we don't know. We've only got a mini portrait here, but
yeah.
we don't have any sense in which she really grappled with this, or even thought that okay, so it's only a mini portrait we've got here, but did she grapple with that? Did she ask questions of people? Did she stop to think that okay, her father's approach might not be the only approach, and those kind of things? So it's very much kind of it, quite quickly dismissed there. What did you think about that?
I came across a little piece by J.C. Ryle that I'd like to share with you. Just The scripture teaches plainly that God rules everything in this world, that he deals with nations as they deal with him, that national prosperity and national decline are ordered by him, and that without his blessing no nation can prosper. Whether men like to see it or not, I believe that it is the first duty of a state to honor and recognize the true God. The sinews of a nation's strength are truthfulness, honesty, sobriety, purity, temperance, economy, diligence, brotherly kindness, charity amongst its inhabitants. Let those deny this who dare. And will any man say that there is any surer way of producing these characteristics in a people than by encouraging and fostering and spreading and teaching pure scriptural Christianity? The man who says there is must be an infidel. The government which ignores religion and coolly declares that it doesn't care whether its subjects are Christians or not is guilty of an act of suicidal folly. Irreligion, even in a temporal point of view, is the worst enemy of a nation. In what manner God would punish England if English governments cast off all connection with religion, I cannot tell. Whether he would punish us by some sudden blow, such as a defeat in war and the occupation of our territory by a foreign power, whether he would waste us away gradually and slowly by placing a worm at the root of our commercial prosperity, whether he would break us to pieces by letting fools rule over us and allowing parliaments to obey them, and permitting us, like the Midianites, to destroy one another, whether he would ruin us by sending a dearth of wise statesmen into the upper ranks and giving the reins of power to communists, socialists, and mob leaders. All these are points which I have no prophetical eye to see, and I do not pretend to determine God's sorest judgment, which the ancients said are like millstones. They grind very slowly, but they grind very fine. The thing I fear most for my country is gradual and sensible dry rot and decay. But of one thing I am very sure: the state that begins by sowing the seed of national neglect of God will sooner or later reap a harvest of national disaster and national ruin. That was J.C. Ryle and the Principles for Churchmen. And I've said a lot there. That spoke to me. It was providential. You sent me the article. I read through it, and then I was on Twitter for 2 minutes, and that came up, and I read through it. I had to read it again, and I thought, there are some people somewhere who are rejoicing at this survey, and God bless them. God have mercy on them, because we've known this, and we've been laboring with this heavy burden that God has sent upon this nation, this judgment. I think you hit the nail on the head, basically, that these people, this article, but these three people clearly have a very, very different, I would say, unrecognizable definition, understanding of Christianity. I think Christianity starts with God. It starts with God and who we are to him, who we are, our duties to him, rather than, and this again is the sense I got from these three articles, that Christianity one of them even says, just didn't keep up with the times. It hasn't changed to reflect the views that I've now got. And I felt, honestly, I finished that article basically with the sense, I have no recollection or recognition of what these people are talking about.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah.
When you were reading that J.C. Ryle quote there, I was thinking about how recently, I'm sure it was in the Church of England, talking about the World Cup final, which is on Sunday, the 18th of December, and saying that churches might want to think about moving their worship services and things like this for the World Cup final, sorry. Kind of thinking that England might get through and all that kind of stuff. I was like, okay, interesting. It just shows the sort of priorities of.
Yeah.
I'm a football, but I like football. I like watching football matches, but I think you've got to show your priorities. Where are your priorities? Or like in America, there's been a bit of a debate. I think recently I see on Twitter. Although I'm off Twitter for Advent. Thank the Lord, because you can spend too much time on there. It's not healthy. But there was a bit of a debate over like some churches deciding they're going to close on Christmas Day, so people spend time with their family. And I was like, what, like, there's stuff like that. To be fair, growing up, we would sometimes travel on Christmas Day to visit family, but my views have changed. I think it's incredibly important to meet together and to worship God. to give that day to whatever you think about how Christmas goes in this country and the cultural baggage that comes with it. But we've got this opportunity to rejoice in the birth of Christ and the incarnation. And like,
Mm.
why would we want to be at church? I want to be sharing in that joy with others. So anyway, you see those sort of decline, and then you see it in like Bishop Stephen Croft talking about how his and lots of bishops support of same-sex marriage, and effectively saying we need to move with the times. Yeah, it's that same thing, isn't it? We need to move with
Yeah.
the times. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I agree with you though. These stories and some of these almost like I don't believe in the God that they believed in, or that it looks like they believed in as well.
Yeah. Well, there's two fundamental things. There's one as a straw man, right?
Yeah,
This is Christianity, and this is what we're attacking. And you and I are just sitting there in the distance, going,
yeah.
okay. You didn't even ask, like you said about the lady with the, have you even explored theology, madam? Have you actually asked these deeper questions and made an honest effort? But they don't need to. They just need a straw man to um, to attack. And the second one, I I recognise that there's a real need for the church at the moment to start giving answers to real questions. At the same time, it isn't like those answers aren't out there on the internet.
Oh yeah,
So
sure.
if people honestly want to research theology, it's not a question of there's so many answers and there's fake news and fake information. We trust in a personal God. If people seek for him, he will meet them and he will provide answers to them. But at the end of the day, these people didn't lose their faith because God didn't give them an answer. These people lost their faith, if they even had a faith, because they won't honor and glorify God the way that he commands them to honor him. And that fundamentally for me was the red flag in this article, starting off with the position, basically, God's in the dock and I get to judge him, rather than, which is basically the duty of the church, to kindly and lovingly, but honestly and truthfully preach the gospel, which fundamentally starts with the realization, with the proclamation, you are a sinner in need of a savior. And there is something just
Yeah,
desperately wrong with you, and it's called sin. And you want to sin, and you want to betray God and rebel against Him, and that is your sinful fleshful nature. And Christ will give you a new nature. Christ will restore you, and that is part of baptism. It isn't that you are made perfect in baptism, but that's a declaration by you to reflect the start of the process that the Holy Spirit will work in you and which God promises he will complete. That's totally different. It is quite literally the opposite perspective to what this Christianity light is talking about, church attendance, as if, yes, it is important, but that is not a fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith, is whether you attend church. It's, do you have a relationship with the living God? Are you yourself spiritually alive? You who were once dead, have you been made alive? Have you been made new? And until we grasp these weighty truths, and until your blue collar workers and scaffolders and shop fitters and hairdressers are conversant with these weighty truths, that they've broken out of the four walls of the church and they just flooded these islands again, I am afraid we're in for a fairly long period of decay. I think that the disestablishment of the Church of England is almost inevitable. Whether or not it ever happens officially, I don't know. I think
well,
for it basically it's happened in function. But
it's quite a nice seg. Well, whether you want to segue or not now, but that's
yeah, go
actually
ahead,
quite
mate. Let's go ahead.
a constitutional reform that Keir Starmer has
We've got 10
because
minutes.
the constitutional reform that Keir Starmer's talking about in terms of the Lords. I think I haven't really read it, but I'm assuming he just wants a democratically elected House of Lords.
Uh, yeah, there seems to be a combination of at least public desires, one of which is to have more devolved power to Wales, Scotland,
Okay.
presumably the Midlands, Manchester. I mean, God can strike a straight line with a crooked stick. Um, I would like to see more devolved power. I would like to see more real democracy. I think democracy is imperfect. It's certainly not a biblical blueprint. That is everybody should be allowed freedom, but the idea of mob rule, that the voice of the majority determines truth, is not biblical. That said, would we like the alternative? It's kind of like Winston Churchill said, democracy is imperfect, but it's the best we've got. I'm not one of these anti-democracy people, but I am very, very, very aware of its limitations everywhere, but particularly when you try and have democracy on a scale of tens of millions. That seems to me just a recipe for tyranny. And it's
the link I was making was between disestablishment of the Church of England and the idea that if we reform the House of Lords, pretty much most people talking about the reform of the House of Lords are talking about a democratic elected House of Lords, which means that the Church of England bishops no longer sit in the House of Lords. If you couple that together with the king we have now and his sort of pluralistic views religious in terms of religion, which I think, I'm assuming, maybe I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, interested to see what his speech would be like at Christmas, and put that together with the
I hadn't thought about that. Yes.
Put that together with the splintering of the Church of England anyway over same-sex marriage. If you get a House of Lords and you remove the bishops, if you get pretty much a splintering of the Church of England anyway, and then you've got King Charles on the throne, I think it all sort of points to a gradual erosion of church and state anyway, which I don't have any stake in the game on. I don't have any. I'm not sort of. You've made all those points earlier about J.C. Ryle thing, so I'm kind of toying with what I'm thinking here now, but I'm not sure about church and state, so I don't have kind of a problem in some ways with the separation.
Nor do I. My understanding has always been that the classic atheist argument of we want a devolution of church and state, and they go from the perspective of we don't want a theocracy. Well,
right.
You and I would probably both arrive at the logical conclusion that a theocracy is inevitable because human beings are religious worshippers. We are worshipping beings. We were made to worship. Well, who are we going to worship? Are we going to worship the triune God, or are we going to worship man? And man in his highest collective form is the state. So anarchy is basically is always temporary. You will never have a anarchy that lasts long, because totalitarianism, basically tyranny, the rule of the powerful man, think Nimrod, Cain, these Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh, these representations in the Bible of the highest pinnacle, of human collective power. They become an object of deistic worship. They themselves become worshipped, and it's no surprise that prior to Christ, probably even after Christ in parts of the world, that the leaders were themselves the ladder rung, if you will, between earth and heaven. The Pharaoh was in communion with God. He himself was a demigod. That's just going to return in its modern form. If we get rid of worship of God, that doesn't stop us worshipping. It's like Romans 1. We worship creation instead. And God just returns us to our folly. In terms of the constitutional reform, in terms of democracy, I wish I could trust Keir Starmer. I wish I could trust any of these politicians, but I don't see any of them, with a track record of genuinely wanting to bring devolved power back to, I don't know, 50,000 people as a
right. Yeah, sure.
So, until Westminster truly devolves legislative and power of taxation, I think is the critical one. I just don't really think all of this is just ornamentation on a sinking ship.
I think also it's kind of probably calculated to thinking about what makeup of the House of Lords would best reflect our values, and therefore how much more easily our legislation would pass through the two chambers. So I think it's kind of a slightly calculated one of
for sure. That's a good point. That is a good point.
a bit of political calculation in it. Whereas I think Conservatives may be slightly more comfortable with having a more traditional makeup of the House of Lords and an older generation, generally speaking, there that may be probably percentage-wise slightly more inclined to agree with their policies. I might be I've made that slightly on the hoof, but I think there could be a little bit of political calculation there from Starmer.
I think almost certainly. So my only hope is that God is merciful and uses. You can speak through the mouth of a mule. He can certainly speak through Keir Starmer. We'll just have to wait and see. I don't see many figureheads at the moment in Britain, which is partly why we started this. Certainly, why I felt compelled to strong arm you into starting a podcast, is because we can only affect influence where we are within our spheres. Where God's given us influence, we've got to affect that with light, leaven, and light, leaven, and salt. And I hope that what is very, very clearly, I think it's been protracted. You and I are in our 20s and our 30s. I think this has probably been going on since before either of us were born, that God is getting rid of old wineskins. He doesn't refill old wineskins. That's not his role. That is not what God does. He has said it very, very clearly. Old wineskins good for nothing. Throw them on the rubbish pile. I'm going to create new wineskins, and I think I prophesy that God is raising up a new form of church that is growing up, that it's coming to seed, and it's coming to fruition outside of the spotlight. I think we're a church in exile in this country at the moment, and my prayer is that we're not going to stay there. I think God's promises and the post-millennial hope, if you will, of Christ's lordship over the planet means that someday this country will return to him. But the next few decades, I think officially on the surface, we're just going to see continued decline. But my hope is that, in the council estates, in the housing association, housing developments, in our neighborhoods, that those Christians, those true Christians that God has called, are going to be working and laboring unseen, like in the old Roman Empire. Collapse is on the way. These people cannot build and sustain a civilization with the theology that they've got. So whether it takes a generation, 2 generations, 5 generations, I don't know. We labor faithfully anyway, but I think the role, like the attitude of British and European Christians, is going to have to change pretty sharpish en masse, if we're going to see this out and affect quick change. I'm just looking that we've got 1 minute left. Shall we?
Yeah. Okay.
Should we wrap this episode up and then restart?
Yeah.
All right, mate.
Sure. Okay.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, guys. That was episode 6. I hope you enjoyed our rambling conversation through constitutional reform and the Guardianistas' perspectives on Christianity. Until next time. Thank you, Tom.
Yes.